All right, now we're going to implement filtering. So when we click on a genre, we only see the games that match the selected genre. So here in the genre list component, the first thing we need to do is replace this text component with a button so we can click on our genres. So let's add a button here. And then we should set variant to link so our buttons look like links. With that, here's what we get. Beautiful. Now let's handle the click event and log the selected genre on the console. So here we set onClick to a function, and here we log the current genre. This is the genre that we are rendering. Okay, so let's click on action and look at the console tab. Oops, we have a bunch of errors here. So we have each child in the list should have a unique key. This is coming from game grid, where we used a game card container. So before going further, let's quickly get rid of this so it doesn't get in the way. So we go to our game grid component. This is where we are rendering a game card container. So previously we added the key on game card skeleton, but after we wrapped the skeleton with the container, we forgot to move the key up here. Okay, we have to make the same change one more time. All right, now back in the browser, refresh. There is still one more error. We need to set a unique key in platform icon list. So let's go to platform icon list. All right, this is where we are mapping objects. So I forgot to add a key here. We should set this to platform.id. Okay, one more time, refresh. No more errors, lovely. Now let's select action. Okay, here's the genre that we selected, beautiful. Now we need to share the selected genre with our game grid. Now here's a question. How can we share a state between two components? We talked about this earlier in the course. To share a state between two components, we should lift it up to the closest parent. Now, what is the parent of these components? It's the app component. That's where we have the genre list and the game grid. So we have to go to our app component and declare a state variable for storing the selected genre. So let's go to the app component. Up here, we use the state hook to declare a state variable. Now we should initialize this with null. So initially no genre is selected. Now let's call this genre and the function set genre, or we could call this selected genre. I think that's better. Set selected genre. Now with this, we cannot set selected genre to a different value other than null, because the TypeScript compiler doesn't know that this variable can store genre objects. So here we need to type a generic type argument and say genre. Now we have a compilation error saying argument of type null is not assignable to parameter of type genre. So here we have to say that this variable can either hold a genre object or null. Okay, so here we have our state variable. Now, when we select a genre, our genre list component should notify the app component to set the selected genre. Because as I told you before, the component that holds some state should be the one updating it. So we should go back to our genre list and add a prop for passing a callback function. So we add an interface called props. Here we add a property called onSelectGenre, which is going to be a function that takes a genre object and returns void. Now let's import genre. Good. Now let's add the props. So onSelectGenre. And finally, down here, instead of logging the selected genre on the console, we pass it to onSelectGenre. Good. Now we have an error in our app component because we haven't passed this prop to our genre list. So we said onSelectGenre. Here we pass a function that takes the genre object. Now here we call setSelectedGenre. Okay, let's test our application up to this point. So back in the browser, I'm going to select Adventure. Now let's open up DevTools and go to the Components tab. Now here we have a bunch of components. Don't worry about them. Just look at the app component. So here we have a state variable that holds the selected genre. Beautiful. Next, we need to pass this to our game grid so it can be passed to the backend while fetching the games. So let's go to our game grid component and add a prop. Interface props. Here we add selected genre, which can be either a genre object or null. Now we should add this here. Selected genre. Now we should pass this to our game's hook. So let's add that here as an argument, selected genre. And that means we have to modify this hook and give it a parameter called selected genre, which can be a genre object or null. Now we need to make another change here. We need to pass this to our data hook. Now our data hook currently only takes an endpoint, but we can make this more flexible by giving it an Axios request config object. Let me show you what I mean. So let's go to this hook. On this line where we send a fetch request, look at the object that we pass as the second argument. This is what we call an Axios request config object. In this object, we can pass data in the request body. We can also set query string parameters and so on. So we can give this hook a second parameter called request config of type Axios request config. Now, if you want to make this optional, so we don't always have to pass it, okay? Now, to filter games by genre, we have to pass the genre as a query string parameter. Let me show you why. So back to the documentation of ROG API. Let's look at the games endpoint. Look, to get the list of games, we can pass these query parameters. So here we have a parameter called genres, which is a string, which includes a bunch of values separated by comma. We can pass genre IDs or their slugs. So that means when using the data hook, we should pass the genres as a query string parameter. So back to the game's hook, here we add an object. In this object, we set params. This is one of the properties of Axios request config object. So we set params to an object. In this object, we set genres to, and here we pass selected genre dot ID. Now, because selected genre can be null, here we use optional chaining. So if selected genre is null, genres will also be null, okay? So we pass this object to our data hook. Now, back to our data hook. After we set the signal here, we need to spread the request config object to add any additional properties here, okay? We're almost there. Let's test our application up to this point and see what happens. So let's refresh. Initially, we get all the games. Lovely. Now, what if we select action? Nothing is happening, but let's look at the network tab and see what we are sending to the server. So let's go to the network tab. Look, we are not sending any additional requests to the server. So these are the first two requests that we sent to load the page. One to get the games, the other to get the genres. If we select any genres here, look, we are not sending any additional requests to the server. Can you explain why this is happening? Here's the answer. Here in our data hook, we are using the effect hook to fetch the data from the server. Now look at our array of dependencies. We passed an empty array here, which means we're going to fetch the data only once the first time a component is rendered. To solve this issue, we need to pass an array of dependencies here. So when the selected genre changes, we send another request to get the games that match the selected genre. How can we do this? Well, we need to add a third parameter here. That is going to be our dependencies. So we call this deps, which is going to be an array of dependencies. Now, at this point, we don't know the type of those dependencies, so we have to use any array. Now, here we have a compilation error because we have added this parameter after an optional parameter. Once we declare a parameter as optional, all the following parameters have to be optional as well, which in this case makes perfect sense because we don't want to pass the dependencies array every time we use the data hook. So let's make this optional. Good. The error goes away. Now down here, we need to spread the dependencies array. Now here we have another compilation error saying that any array or undefined must have a symbol.iterator. What is happening here is that because we declared this as optional, it could be undefined. Now we cannot spread an undefined object. So here we need to say, if dependencies is truthy, we're going to spread it. Otherwise, we're going to pass an empty array here. So now that our data hook receives the dependencies, we should specify them when calling the data hook. So after we pass the request config, here we add another argument, that is our array of dependencies. In this case, we want to be dependent on selected genre.id. Okay, so let's save the changes. Now the last step, we have to go back to our app component and pass the selected genre to our game grid so everything will work. We set selected genre to selected genre. So now let's refresh. So far, so good. Let's select indie. Now we only see indie games. If we select adventure, we see different set of games. Beautiful. Now, I know there were too many steps involved here, but what we did was actually very simple. So let me quickly recap. In our genre list component, we added a new prop called onSelectGenre. This is to notify the parent or the consumer of this component that a genre has been selected. The parent of this component in this application is our app component. So here we get notified and set the selected genre. Now, this causes the app component to re-render. So in the next render, we'll pass the selected genre to the game grid. Now in our game grid, we added a new prop, which is selected genre. And here we get this value and pass it to our game's hook. Now the game's hook passes the selected genre as a query string parameter to the data hook. So as part of this lesson, we had to open up our data hook and make it more flexible. So now we can pass query string parameters or request data to our request objects. We also added an array of dependencies. So if any of these dependencies changes, our effect will rerun and refetch the data from the server. So now it's time to commit our code to the repository. So here we say filter games by genre.